Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Bluegrass Jamalong is also brought to you by Token Picks, individually machined guitar and mandolin picks to bring out the best in you and your instrument.
You know, they were just playing what they wanted to play. And again, to me, it speaks to the drive that they had, what they were trying to say with their music. It was true art because they weren't worried about what the outcome would be. They had started a band. They were clearly not going to drive or get into an airplane and just go anywhere for the least amount of money. They were going to do it their way. And this album, to me, really screams like, yeah, this is what we're doing. This is our identity. This is our art. You can take it or leave it.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. This week I have an interview with Missy Raines for you. Missy has been on Bluegrass Jamalong before, as I'm sure lots of you know. I interviewed her a couple of years ago about her wonderful record Highlander, and I really enjoyed that conversation. It was one of my favourite episodes of all the 500 odd episodes of this podcast. Just a really lovely conversation, and really enjoyed getting to chat to Missy, and so I thought I'd invite her back to let her pick a record to talk about. I really kind of find these conversations about somebody else's music really intriguing because I learn something. People talk about other people's music in a different kind of way than they do their own. And Missy has picked Seldom Scene Act Two, and there's so many reasons I enjoyed this conversation. It's a record that runs sort of through Missy's life and speaks of her upbringing and where she grew up, but also the point in time this happened, what was going on in the string band world. It's a formative part of her kind of becoming a musician, but also later on she got to sit in and play with the band, and that was fascinating to talk about. Just such an interesting time and place kind of to look at this whole context, and something that's, you know, I've listened to a lot of music that came before this and music that came after this, and this early 70s period is probably a little bit of a hazy spot for me, so it's really interesting to sort of fill in some gaps and think about that and talk about that and listen to the music. Really enjoyed this one. Usual stuff. If you want more on Bluegrass Jamalong, do go to bluegrassjamalong.com. There's a full list of all the interviews there, including my earlier interview with Missy, which I'll stick a link in the show notes to save you going wandering around if you haven't heard that one. But yes, it's all on the website if you need it. Lots of cool stuff on there, all the backing tracks, chord sheets, and all of that. But yeah, here is Missy Raines talking about Seldom Scene Act Two. Hope you enjoyed this one. Missy Raines, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. It is great to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. There's something lovely about having a chat about somebody else's music. You get a very different kind of conversation, and I'm looking forward to this one. And can you tell us which record you've picked to talk about this week?
Yeah, I have chosen the Seldom Scene Act Two.
And how did this record and this music come into your life?
You know, my folks were already into music, particularly bluegrass, when I was, when I came into this world. So I didn't really have an option there. But they were taking me to see live music. There was music being played on the stereo, and of course, among them, the sounds that were prominent were the Country Gentlemen, the original Country Gentlemen, and then later the Seldom Scene. And those were bands that I saw regularly, and especially the Seldom Scene. I remember the first time hearing them when they just became a band. So it was a very important band for me, and influenced a huge amount of my earliest memories of seeing live music and all that. And of course, the band had the bass player who kind of inspired me to want to play bass, which was Tom Gray. So there was it came very organically into my life. I think it was always, the scene was always there. The Country Gentlemen, which included John Duffy, those early sounds. Thanks to Carlton Haney, who was the promoter of the festivals that we were attending at that time.
And it's a really interesting, for me it's really interesting because this is a little bit of a gap. I listened to quite a bit of kind of first generation bluegrass, and I listened to a lot of late 70s stuff, but there's a really interesting bridge in the sort of 60s and 70s between what happened and what came afterwards, and it definitely feels like Country Gentlemen and the Seldom Scene are a very big part of that. They kind of occupy a really historically interesting space between kind of the Munros and the Stanleys and the Flatt and Scruggs and the stuff that then came after that, and the kind of whole jam band scene and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I think their role was huge in that transition, so to speak, in that they created some really important music during that time, and it was informed from a different place. Like, it was informed from like an urban sensibility, and which wasn't exactly unique at the time, but it definitely was very specific to what they were doing.
And that's a really interesting word, urban, isn't it? Because that bit coming out of the folk revival, which was often centred around cities and around colleges, and then you think of the things that kind of went on in the San Francisco Bay Area and Nashville and some other stuff that was happening in and around New York State. It's still recognisably bluegrass and continues all of those things that you love about bluegrass, but it's got a really interesting different sensibility, as you say.
Yeah. And I found it to be like, I was a kid, and I found it interesting and different. Nothing still affects me the same as like hearing Ralph Stanley sing, Man of Constant Sorrow and all of that stuff like that. That hits me to a core very deep within. But then also getting to hear music sort of that was being influenced and informed by newer folk music and that sort of thing. At the time, it was just really interesting, and I just found it like I wanted to find out more about it, and it caught my interest in a different way.
Yeah, and it's easy to see how maybe a newer generation that might have dismissed Bill Monroe and the rest of them as kind of being old-fashioned by that point would relate really strongly to a band like Seldom Scene and bringing in songs that were outside of traditional bluegrass. And there's sort of there's a really interesting the vocal blend in itself, and the way they present it vocally was different, and the idea of not everything's kind of like it's quite a way through Act Two before you get to a traditional kind of boom chuck bluegrass groove as well. And so it's like, it sounds bluegrass, it has all those elements, and it drives really hard when it wants to, but it's also got a kind of a much poppier, folkier sensibility as well, and it's a really kind of appealing blend, isn't it?
It is. As we settled on doing this record, and I was like re-listening to it. Of course, it was such a soundtrack to my youth, but re-listening to it, which I have done many times through the years. Lately, though, I was like really interested by how many songs are started with just the guitar. Like the kickoffs are just guitar, and which gives it almost like a folk thing, but it's not. As soon as they start playing, it's not folk music, but it is a very unique presentation of the bluegrass. And so what's also interesting to me is I think about what else was happening at that time in the early 70s. Newgrass Revival was being born, and J.D. Crowe was starting a band that was different than the Kentucky Mountain Boys. So it was a little less traditional. So there were lots of people doing that kind of thing in their own way. And of course, Sam's Newgrass Revival had this real influence more from a blues and a rock and roll standpoint, whereas the influences here were very different. And so I just think it was just a fascinating and beautiful time for music.
Yeah, and you've got people like Clarence White, who'd spent some time in the Byrds by that point and was clearly kind of deeply ingrained in the bluegrass world, but also kind of really instrumental in that kind of California country rock Americana, like lots of things being born out of that would come on to, and sadly Clarence didn't kind of last to see that through, and it's wonderful kind of that influence that he had, and you can only imagine where that would have gone afterwards, and that all feels like it came out of a similar time, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was just such a remarkable time, and there are hotbeds across the U.S. particularly that were servicing those sounds, and people were learning about bluegrass on the big screen too. In movies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and there's the kind of it wasn't quite an Oh Brother moment, but you had the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album around that time as well, and just interest in this crossover between a newer generation and an older generation, and bluegrass and mountain music and more kind of folk revival influenced stuff was sort of everywhere, wasn't it? We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. Founded in Petaluma, California, and born of a love for music, Token has developed a unique approach to making picks. Individually machined from premium materials like Ultem, Peak, and compression moulded Taulon, Token picks are designed to bring clarity, speed, and tone to your playing. Used by top artists like Chris Eldridge, Jake Workman, Andy Falco, and Trey Hensley, Token picks are fast becoming a bluegrass favourite. Follow on Instagram at TokenMade and learn more at tokenmade.com.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Radio, which was actually really big then, and determined careers. You had bands like the Eagles and that were on the airwaves, so people were hearing like these folk influenced sounds, even banjo on lots of things. They were hearing that on popular radio, FM radio, and I think that was that also like softened the blow, so to speak, of people hearing things like Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and they were seeing that there was this whole subculture that existed with the marriage of all these different sounds coming together. Yeah, so I think that it was just a really interesting time. People like Earl Scruggs, now we're talking like later mid-70s, people like Earl Scruggs who had left the Platt and Scruggs situation sometime before that, was doing kind of just whatever he wanted to. And what he wanted to do was play music with his sons. And they were absolutely not playing bluegrass. They were playing what you would call like folk rock at that time, with a banjo. And of course, Earl's fronting this band, but they had drums and electric guitar and electric bass, and they were playing, originals and covers from that folk rock era. So it was a whole different thing. And
Well, and that you sort of mentioned with the Eagles, that sort of smoother vocal blend. And, you've kind of got this interesting mix Seldom Scene, because it's a kind of, what they're delivering feels like a song first thing, where sometimes bluegrass can feel like a song is a vehicle for instrumental breaks and hot picking, and there's that there, but the song comes first and the vocal blend comes first, and this lovely sound, and yet you've still got like John Duffy in there, and you've got some bluegrass spice going on in there, but it's just a slightly more, I guess, refined sound than people were used to.
I love that, what you just said about, the song first, the lyric, it was really important. John Starling, and what I love about this record is that John Starling's writing comes through in a way that really shows a side of him that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, that, he wrote several of these songs. So he was a great singer, he was a great guitar player. He did not really play leads on the guitar at all. Like, again, it was just like a step away from that, virtuosic bluegrass sort of approach that we have on all of our instruments. And yeah, I think, when I think about their stage show, which I was very fortunate to get to see many, many times, Duffy's approach to how he talked to the audience was unique, very unique, and he didn't do the sort of traditional scripted MC work that I had been used to hearing, and many people hearing folks just talk about how glad they were to be in front of playing in front of the audience, and that this was part of the show, and it was all very kind of lined out in a very traditional sort of way. But Duffy broke all those rules from the get-go, and it was clear that he was just talking to people as if he were standing in a room with you and with, you all were having coffee or something together. And he talked about events of the day, whatever was happening in the news, and he mentioned them and he made jokes about it. And a lot of people didn't know quite what to think about it, but they also really loved it. And people were coming. It was also the time when people were coming to see a band, to see not just how they sounded, because they could always fulfill that. They at the end of the day, their harmonies and their performance like sold the show. But people were also coming to see what Duffy was going to say, what he was going to talk about, and how funny it was going to be, how entertaining it was going to be. But the entertainment wasn't ever scripted or some sort of routine that you saw every time. Like, he broke that mold. He made it like, no, it's just going to be what's going to be funny today.
And he's a really interesting figure in this band, isn't he, John Duffy? Because he'd been around for a while, and from the things I've heard and things I've read, he'd sort of quit the Country Gentlemen and decided to go off and kind of work on guitars and have a different kind of path in life. But then he gets jamming with this bunch of younger guys and decides, no, we're going to do this again, but we're going to do it our way. We're going to be the band that we want to be, because they all still largely had careers elsewhere. They weren't going to be buying the bus and spending all their time traveling around the country. They were doing a different version of it. But he kind of, even though Country Gentleman to Seldom Scene is like a decade, feels like an older character within all of that, and a kind of elder statesman, weirdly, in it, but amongst a bunch of younger people.
Yeah, absolutely. And he definitely had a different approach. He saw it as like, we don't have to get into a van and beat ourselves up traveling all over the world just to bring this music to people. And honestly, to like not be compensated for it in a way that made the difference for his family. I mean, that was his view, and you kind of gotta love that. It's not how many of us have approached it, for sure. And I wonder, again, knowing, how he grew up, and his father was an opera singer at the Metropolitan Opera. I don't know. And so he was, I only can assume that he sort of saw music as being like, as art, as being something that was well paid for. It was compensated for. Art was something valued. And if you really want this art, then you're going to do what you have to do to make that happen in an appropriate way. But frankly, many bluegrass, but not only bluegrass, but many art forms of musics that are not as popular, people don't value it the way I think they should. People have done. You think of this kind of music. Oh, I can just go down to my corner and hear people jam, and it's bluegrass, and I shouldn't have to pay for that. And, there's a little bit of that mindset. So I think that Duffy's mindset was definitely, he had witnessed people being willing to pay for art and place value on art. And I think that's a pretty powerful feeling.
I think there's also something really positive as like an idea that you can be a bunch of people who have other careers who also play music, but you take that seriously, and that is a career. Like, the idea that you can be a musician and something else at the same time is a really valid thing. And, as a band, they all had really involved other things going on, and some of them left to pursue those. And there's something really lovely about that. And maybe that's just me, because I do this podcast aside from a day job. I have two things going on at the same time. And like, somehow the podcast is allowed to be more what it needs to be, because it isn't the only thing that brings in the money. And I have something else going on. And so maybe that just resonates more with me. But I think one thing I was going to ask you is, how much do you feel like location plays a part in the story? Because they weren't touring as much, and so their kind of gig was built around a couple of regular residencies. And as you say, people would come back to kind of hear what Duffy was going to say, and having your crowd and kind of having a residency and being in one place a lot is different to being on the road and playing to different people every night. And you can build a kind of relationship with the audience in a different sort of way, can't you?
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful point. And their residency, as you say, I think you might be referring to like their sit down gig at the Birchmere in Alexandria, Virginia, every Thursday for years and years. And the fact that that residency is in a huge metropolitan area, such as it was, so it was covering, DC and Maryland and southern Pennsylvania and northern Virginia. Yeah, there's so many people that could have fairly easy access to see them, and I think that played a huge part of it. And I remember when they did perform at festivals, I remember, they were the headliners, and their show was the last show of the night, and people would just gather to see, yeah, exactly that. What is going to happen? What's he going to say? What's he going to do? What story is going to develop over this performance? And it was magical every single time.
And that sort of metropolitan area you just described there, like, I'm not from the States, and I might be misreading this, but it feels like just geographically that occupies a really interesting spot between kind of southern Appalachian states and some of the roots of the music, and the kind of northeast, and where a lot of the folk revival happened. And it feels like there's a really interesting geographical musical story happening in that bit of America anyway.
Absolutely. And I think it's a critical part of the story. So I can relate to this pretty well, because even though I didn't grow up in an urban area, I grew up very rurally in West Virginia, but I was only about 150 miles away from this part. It was a very rural 150 miles in the mountains, but still, I grew up in what I can consider in the mid-Atlantic area of the country. And so it wasn't southern, it wasn't northern, it was something in between. And that band of area of the part of West Virginia that I'm from, and Western Maryland, southern Pennsylvania, northern Virginia, that part that I speak of, that went all the way over to that metro, the Washington D.C. area, and it is a unique area, geographical area that is responsible for many of bluegrass's greatest artists, folks like Del McCoury and the Johnson Mountain Boys, and Bob Paisley and Ted Lundy and Buzz Busby, and there's so many great names that those folks came from that area. What makes that area interesting too is that many Appalachian people looking for more work, more opportunity, better schools, better lives for their children were moving out of the mountains from like where I was from and moving to more industrialized areas, and they were bringing their culture with them. And so this is something that was happening all over, clearly like in the Cleveland area, in the Detroit area, in Chicago, but also in Washington, D.C. So that's what I feel like where a lot of this comes from. There was a definite Appalachian like dump of cultures put into that area, where people could actually make a decent living, finding work and creating lives for their family.
That's a really interesting point, and it feels like a similar thing happened with kind of rural blues for similar reasons. And suddenly you've got a bunch of displaced Southerners in an industrial northern city looking for a bit of home, but also a huge kind of audience beyond that who suddenly have all this music they can go and hear and see. And yeah, it's a really interesting kind of, and it feels like that happened a couple of times, like in the 20s and 30s, there were big migrations towards cities, but again after the Second World War as well. And by that point, like radio and gramophone and all these things are really established, and the country starts to feel smaller because of communications, and then suddenly there are bigger markets for kind of what was originally rural music, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it was always interesting to me, like on Act Two, where the Seldom Scene redid Paradise, which of course the John Prine song. Now, Jim and Jesse had recorded that song before this, like, I don't know, maybe a decade or two before that. And in fact, the Seldom Scene's version is very similar to Jim and Jesse's, like with the pulsing kind of dun, 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 like kind of thing. And and Jim and Jesse, of course, were from Southwest Virginia, so I don't know. I just find that interesting that was a song that that the Seldom Scene chose to do, and I always found it to be it felt natural for them to do that, even though it was basically a coal mining song.
Well, and just the range of stuff, like I'm just looking at the list of the songs on here, and you've got like some Norman Blake, you've got some John Prine, you've got like Hello Mary Lou, you've got Lara's theme from Dr. Zhivago, and you can read where all these things came from, but as you listen through, it all hangs together beautifully as a record, and it all feels like them.
Absolutely. Yes. And that is the beauty of it, the way that theme runs through. And that is so hard to do. It's hard to do that with music, that when you're grabbing it from all these different genres and you're pulling it into your little playpen, and how to make it sound like it's not a different band every single time. That's really hard to do.
And a really interesting point you made before about the guitar introductions, because just listening to, Last Train from Poor Valley, the Norman Blake track that opens it, is a very folky, strummed kind of guitar thing, and it doesn't scream bluegrass at you straight away. And then as you sell out, I hadn't sort of connected with just how many songs start like that. But you've also got this really interesting texture of, you've still got banjo in, which is a really strong kind of bluegrassy flavour, but there's no fiddle. And you've got a dobro instead, which is this must have been one of the first real bands to push that as a role, but also it's a really interesting mix, isn't it? Because banjo and fiddle are the most bluegrassy kind of combination of things out there, and when you take one of those two things out of the mix, and often people take the banjo out to have a folkier sound, but it's not here. The banjo is still very much there, but you've got a dobro, and it just gives it a different kind of quality.
Yeah, it does. And what I loved about what they did with these songs was that just the fact that this was the second album that they recorded and they were brand new on the scene. Again, it also speaks to, they weren't thinking of like, oh, we have to do something. This is our sophomore album. We have to follow it up with some sort of big hit. They weren't thinking that way at all. It's clear, because honestly, if you just like go down through each song and listen to just a few seconds of each one, the tempos are all similar for the most part. The tempos are similar. It's not till you get into it that you start to hear the differences. In other words, they weren't trying to blow anyone's face off. They were just playing what they wanted to play. And again, so that speaks to it speaks to the drive that they had, their what they were trying to say with their music. It was true art, because they weren't worried about what the outcome would be. They had started a band. They were clearly not going to drive or get into an airplane and just go anywhere for the least amount of money. They were going to do it their way. And this album, to me, really screams like, yeah, this is what we're doing. This is our identity. This is our art. You can take it or leave it.
And it sounds from things that I've read that very much extended to the live shows as well, and that they'd have a song or two to start, but there wouldn't be a set list. It was like, what do we want to play today? And they'd end up just discussing it on stage, and somebody goes, should we do this? And, you wouldn't just get the show. Absolutely.
Yeah, you just never knew what was going to happen. And they would often open a set with like 3-part harmony, just singing over, like Walk Through This World With Me, like they might, a complete slow tearjerker, beautiful harmony, but still, like, I don't know, if there was some sort of a textbook as to how to run a show up to that point, the first page might say, well, start with a big, something fast in B.
Yeah.
kick off with the banjo, get them going, and then do your thing. I mean, that might be part of what a textbook might say, but they didn't. They broke all those rules, and I think people are breaking those rules a lot now, but back then people weren't breaking those rules like that.
Yeah, well, it is really interesting. So much of the music we've talked about and that sort of period, people were taking an existing thing and treating it with love and reverence, but also going like, what does it, picking it up and moving it around, looking at it from other angles and going, what does this mean to me? What do I want to do with this? And I talked to David Greer a while ago about Clarence White, and he said that was very much what he loved about it, is it didn't feel like your parents' bluegrass, like it felt like your own thing. And ironically, in your kind of experience, it was also your parents' bluegrass, but I totally get that idea of it feeling like a new look at an existing thing.
Absolutely, and I love that. That's really hits it on the head. My parents were pretty cool. they were pretty ahead of their time, but yeah, no, I never thought of it as like, trying to do something that my parents didn't like. But yeah, absolutely. That this was a new thing. This was something different. It was clearly breaking molds, and I sure was ready for it. I was just at the right age when I was like, yeah, this is what I want.
And you mentioned earlier on that Tom Gray was a big influence on you wanting to like pick up a bass in the first place, and later on you got to play with the band, didn't you? I'd love to hear a little bit of your kind of personal journey with that as well, from being a little girl going to see them through to getting to play with them.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was an amazing experience. And John Duffy was incredible. He, to me, like, he was so supportive, but yet at the same time, kind of like, I mean, he definitely didn't coddle. Like, he wasn't like, I was only, gosh, how old was I? I was probably 20 or something. I don't know. But I felt very young. Like, I mean, that is young, but I felt even younger. And he didn't coddle me at all. Like, he didn't kind of like, it's going to be great. Or he never said anything like that. He just kind of was like, so you're here, you're going to play this gig. This is what we're doing. Whereas the others, like, I remember Mike Aldridge being particularly like this extra friendly and smiling and trying to, make me feel comfortable. And Duffy, he did not make me feel uncomfortable, but he absolutely didn't go out of his way to make me like try to like cushion it for me, which I found also really great, because it made me feel like he saw me as like I was for real. Like, I wasn't just a girl coming in and that he had to, kid glove me. I didn't feel like that at all. And that was great, because I really wanted to be treated like an equal, even though I didn't for a minute perceive myself as being equal to any of those guys at that moment. But I did want to be taken seriously, and he took me seriously. Now, I will say he introduced me again. So this is where like things like that he said and did would not maybe pass the muster these days. But he introduced me as, and now, and here on bass, we have, all I can tell you folks is Tom, what did he say? Tom went to Sweden for an operation and it was a success. I mean, something like that. I don't know if he actually said the word operation, but Tom went to Sweden and it was a success or something like that. So, I mean, clearly this is not something that would go over today, and nor would he have chosen to say it today. But this was 1985 or something, this was a long time ago. But yeah, and it was great. I'll never forget it. They were all just so incredibly supportive, and I felt accepted as an equal, as at least as a bass for hire for the moment.
I remember when we talked last time about your record, and you were talking really passionately about this idea of standing on the shoulders of tradition, and it's really lovely to hear you talk about this record as being part of that kind of journey, and a record that, is so deeply woven into your life. It's not just, here's a record I really like. It's like, here's a record that is part of my story as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I I think that music definitely was deeply embedded and is deeply embedded in my makeup, and has affected many of the things that I've done. And I'm grateful that I got to experience it firsthand.
And I'm grateful that you spent a bit of time talking to me about it. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, Missy.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. It's nice to revisit this music again.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.